Let the night cradle your thoughts, and your curiosity lead the way. Subscribe to follow the quiet trail of history. You slip beneath the covers, and tonight you're not just drifting into sleep, you're stepping into a chamber of time. The torches of ancient Egypt flicker in the corners of your imagination, casting long shadows on stone walls etched with secrets. You may have heard of pyramids and mummies, but what if I told you those same hands that built eternal tombs also reached for something more intoxicating? Something dreamlike? You see, long before the buzz of modern nightlife, there was the Blue Lotus. No neon lights, no thumping bass. Just a flower with soft petals and a reputation that whispered across dynasties. This wasn't your average garden variety plant. In temple halls and festival grounds, the Blue Lotus was not only decoration, it was the invitation. Egyptians didn't just admire it, they infused it into their wine. And in doing so, infused their ceremonies with a dreamy lightness that turned even the sternest rituals into transcendent experiences. Take the petals, steep them in red wine, and let time do the rest. When the moon rose over the Nile, and the prayers echoed through sandstone halls, that infusion brought more than taste. It brought euphoria. Not wild, uncontrollable madness, but a calm unraveling of the ordinary. A feeling like floating, like being gently lifted above the noise of earth, closer to the gods they worshipped. For them, it wasn't called getting high. It was called communion, with with rebirth, with the mysteries stitched into the horizon. Even the act of holding it to one's nose, depicted in murals with deliberate grace, was a ritual of inhaling the divine. A silent prayer in fragrance. Pharaohs held it. Priests blessed it. Even the deceased were adorned with it, as if to say, let the afterlife be light and fragrant and full of joy. It wasn't just an indulgence. It was preparation for transcendence. And then there were the festivals. Imagine a sky full of stars and a courtyard pulsing with laughter. Blue Lotus wine flowed like a river, loosening limbs and releasing tongues. Sacred music danced on the wind, while hieroglyphs told stories too ancient for words. And among the many celebrations, one stood apart in its bold, brilliant defiance of death itself, the Feast of Drunkenness. Yes, that was its real name, but don't be fooled by the crude title. Beneath the chaos was an old wisdom, one that said joy could be a kind of armor. That spiritual elevation sometimes came not in stillness, but in surrender. The myth behind it is worth remembering. A goddess, furious with humanity, on a rampage, until, that is, the other gods slipped her a drink disguised as blood. She drank, she slept, she woke in peace, and in that ancient twist of fate, humanity was spared by intoxication. To honor that strange salvation, the Egyptians met once a year in dawn's early light. Music thundered, hands clapped, cups were raised. It wasn't just a party, it was a sacred unraveling. Participants drank not for pleasure alone, but to open themselves to the divine. Revelers weren't judged, they were encouraged. To laugh, to collapse, to cry, to connect with something larger than themselves. Some even claimed to see the goddess herself, though whether it was divine vision or drink-induced illusion was never quite clear. And no one cared, because the message was the same. Even wrath can be softened. Even pain can be poured out like libation. It was a ritual of release, letting go of fear, shame, and all the hidden griefs that accumulate in the quiet corners of the soul. One tambourine shake at a time. What followed the feast was rarely glamorous. Hangovers, regrets, and probably more than one mysterious bruise shaped like a temple carving. But there was also renewal, the belief that by emptying themselves, physically and spiritually, they made room for something new, something divine. And if you think this was all reserved for royalty or the elite, think again. This was communal. Ordinary people gathered with extraordinary intention, to taste the sacred, to forget death for one night, to dance with the mystery. So as you close your eyes now and drift deeper, imagine yourself in linen robes, lotus wine in hand, the Nile humming in the background. You're not escaping, you're remembering how ancient people used beauty, plants, music, and ritual not just to survive, but to touch the eternal. And maybe, just maybe, that's still possible. Even tonight, you stir your drink in the dimming light of your mind's ancient tavern, where dreams blend with memory, and the scent of warm earth clings to your thoughts. You're walking the dusty roads of Egypt now, where thirst wasn't just physical but spiritual too. And no, we're not pouring wine tonight. You're holding a vessel filled with something far thicker, older, and surprisingly chewy. Yes, you've just been handed ancient Egyptian beer, if you can call it that. A steaming, opaque blend of mashed emmer bread and water, fermented into a sort of liquid bread pudding. Less of a drink and more of a meal that forgot how to be solid. You wouldn't sip this as much as bravely gulp it down, hoping not to chew too long on the past. But for the ancient Egyptians, this was sustenance. It was community. It was survival with a side of spiritual elevation. In fact, beer was everywhere, flowing through the veins of society, from palaces to paddocks, temples to tenements. Pharaohs raised it in gold-rimmed cups. Toddlers slurped it in clay bowls. Even temple scribes and peasant farmers shared in the same strange, porridge-like comfort. It was their daily bread, only wetter. And this beer didn't come with a frothy head or chilled bottle. It was ladled out in jugs and passed around in communal circles, each person drawing from the same thick pool of calories, warmth, and mild intoxication. It wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, nourishing, and deeply woven into the rituals of daily life. Whether it was pyramid builders who were literally paid in liters of beer, or worshippers spicing their brew for temple rites, this was sacred starch at its most creative. Want to feel closer to the gods? Add a pinch of mandrake. Want to silence the priest's long sermon on balance and order? Toss in fermented date juice and drift into the silence of the divine. It wasn't just a drink, it was a doorway. And here's the twist of the Nile. Beer wasn't just the safest option. It was the only sane one. Drinking plain water could land you in the afterlife faster than a crocodile's grin. But beer, it had been boiled, spiced, and blessed by fermentation. It was a healing liquid and a form of social glue. Yes, it might have looked like beige sludge. Yes, it might have required straws with built-in filters to avoid chunks of rogue bread. But it kept them alive, and sometimes it made them laugh. So picture this. Men dragging massive limestone blocks, the sun high and merciless, their bodies dusted in grit. And still, they work with rhythm, strength, and a mild buzz in their step. Their payment? Not coins or treasures, but jars of bread beer, given generously each day. Somehow, in that sandy crucible of sweat and song, the pyramids still rose. Now take a deeper breath, because just when you think you've tasted all Egypt has to offer, something more fragrant stirs the air. Smoke, not the choking kind, but a swirling, perfumed mist. It curls around your imagination like silk, sweet, strange, and ancient. This is Kifi, the incense of pharaohs, temples, and twilight ceremonies. It wasn't made in a hurry. No, this was a sacred alchemy of honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh, and a chorus of other mysterious ingredients that felt more like a dessert than a purification tool. But Kifi was no simple air freshener. It was medicine. It was magic. It was how a room of sandstone and shadow could become a throne room for the divine. Burned slowly in sacred vessels, its smoke thickened the air until reality itself became bendable. You didn't just smell Kifi. You breathed in the cosmos. Inside temples, where torches flickered against polished walls, the priests didn't whisper in solitude. They moved like choreographed shadows, lifting bowls of burning resin into the air, filling the space until seeing clearly became nearly impossible. Was that a statue of a god ahead or a vision? Was that sensation on your skin sacred presence? Or heat stroke? And here's the secret. The Egyptians didn't need to know the difference. Both were holy. Some formulas for Kifi were so complex they read like mystical riddles, with instructions passed down in guarded whispers. Some said it could ease nightmares. Others swore it soothed snake bites. But more than anything, it turned ordinary air into an invisible staircase, each breath a step towards something higher. So tonight, as you lie in stillness, imagine the soft glow of lamps behind lattice screens. Hear the distant hum of ritual chants echoing through corridors carved in stone. Taste the faint hint of honeyed spice drifting on sacred smoke. You're not simply learning about ancient Egypt. You're visiting it. Quietly, curiously, and just buzzed enough on bread, beer, and incense dreams to wonder, what did the gods smell like? And maybe, just maybe, they smelled like home. You open your eyes, not to the world outside, but to a deeper chamber of ancient memory, veiled in smoke and mystery. This time, the air is heavier. The Nile no longer whispers, it watches, because now, you've stepped into the alchemical theater of the ancients, where scent, shadow, and spirit collide. You catch it in the air first, that dense, syrupy trail of incense winding through the corridors like a priest's secret. This isn't your neighbor's candle or a casual puff of frankincense. This is Kifi, Egypt's most sacred smoke. A blend so complex it had to be crafted in moonlit phases with a kind of devotion that would make modern chefs weep. 16 ingredients, each added at just the right moment under just the right sky. Honey, raisins, wine, cinnamon, myrrh, mint, all folded together like a sacred recipe for awakening. Once lit, Kifi didn't just perfume a space, it transformed it. Temples became dream chambers, priests became portals. Even the Nile seemed to pause as the scent rolled over its banks, drifting like a divine fog announcing, something holy lives here. But it wasn't always about reverence. Sometimes, it was about overcompensating for yesterday's fish offering or softening the sting of last night's feast of excess. And sometimes, it was burned during mummification, meant to guide the soul with sweetness instead of silence. If Blue Lotus was the gentle mystic and beer the crowd-pleasing host, Kifi was the theatrical soul-stirrer, part prophet, part showman, and all presence. But just when you think you've met all the guests at this spiritual banquet, someone unexpected arrives. Mandrake. You glance down, and there it is, a root that looks just human enough to give you pause. Mandrake wasn't a common guest. It was the wild card, more feared than favored. Its roots forked like legs. Its effects, unpredictable. Some called it healing. Others whispered of madness. But all agreed, this wasn't something you brewed on a whim. Ancient physicians handled it with a mix of respect and mild terror. Use too little and it wouldn't touch the pain. Use too much and you might wake up believing you were an ibis god married to the moon. It was potent, laced with compounds that played cruel games with your nervous system. Scopolamine, atropine, the kind of ingredients that could soothe your body or send your dreams running into chaos. Still, mandrake earned its place in the medical scrolls. Used for sleep, desire, fertility, and heartbreak. It soothed and seduced in equal measure. And yet, stories of its harvesting live on in the shadowed corners of folklore. They say it screamed when pulled from the earth. Loudly, fatally. The solution: tie the root to a dog, cover your ears, and let instinct do the rest. Whether or not the Egyptians truly practiced this, the fear it inspired was very real. And so was the sense that this plant lived half in this world, half in another. And when the night deepened further, when all else failed, there was one more whisper from Egypt's green apothecary. Shemet. You might know it by another name, cannabis. Hidden in plain sight within ancient medical texts like the Ebers and Ramesseum papyri, it wasn't smoked in circles or rolled into paper. Instead, it was crushed into oils, mixed with honey, or shaped into salves. Used to ease inflammation, soothe sore eyes, and address the intimate pains that no one dared to speak of too loudly. Did they know exactly how it worked? Perhaps not, but they knew it did. Some claim it helped with sleep. Others say it settled the womb. A few believe it calmed the nerves before sacred rites. And while official records avoid suggesting it was used for pleasure, the silence around it speaks volumes. Because when your civilization battles heat, disease, and cosmic anxiety on a daily basis, anything that makes you breathe a little deeper is more than welcome. Archaeologists have even found traces, cannabis, opium, nicotine, preserved in the bones of the departed. Were these medicines, offerings, or perhaps passengers on the journey to the afterlife? No one knows for sure, but when the scent of incense clings to a mummy's wrappings, When residue of plant wisdom lingers in sacred tombs, you start to realize something. The Egyptians didn't just preserve bodies, they preserved states of mind. So tonight, as your breath slows and the edges of your waking world dissolve, remember this. You are inhaling the echoes of people who sought peace in smoke, found visions in roots, and softened reality with bread you had to drink. You are walking through their rituals, and somewhere between the scent of kiffy and the whisper of mandrake, your own dreams begin to shift. You lean back into the silence of your room, the hum of the fan like the wind brushing over desert sands, and just like that, you're inside a temple, not a place of fear, but of whispers, of chants that don't end and smoke that doesn't clear. You're standing among men who could stare into incense until it stared back. These were no ordinary figures. These were priest-physicians, trained not just to speak to the divine, but to medicate the mortal and occasionally themselves. If they reached for sacred herbs, it wasn't out of boredom, it was a bridge. Sometimes to the gods, sometimes to something far stranger. You wander further, past the dried lotus blossoms and honey-scented ointments, and you find it, tucked in a shadowed alcove of the temple pharmacy. Poppy pods. Wrinkled, silent, and powerful. Imported, yes, but embraced as if they'd always belonged. Because when divine chants couldn't touch a man's pain, the gods had opium. Egypt wasn't the poppy's birthplace, but it became one of its earliest and most loyal students. Traded from the islands of the eastern Mediterranean, these small pods carried something profound: sleep, stillness, and surrender. By the New Kingdom, the poppy had become a trusted ritual tool, not just to treat pain, but to cradle the mind during birth, to silence a stubborn cough, or to lull the restless into a sleep deep enough to meet the gods face to face. Opium wasn't always labeled as such. Ancient scrolls were coy, referencing plant extracts and dream-inducing resins. But the results were clear. Temple prescriptions might have read like spiritual poetry, but behind the lines was science, softened by mystery. Mixed into wines, shaped into pills, even used in less expected ways, it became the gentle exhale that followed divine anxiety. And it didn't stop at life. In some cases, opium followed the dead, its sweet heaviness a parting gift for those journeying into eternity. What better way to meet Anubis than blissed out, floating past the celestial scales? But while opium soothed, it also blurred. Used with reverence, it opened doors. Used carelessly, it turned solemn temple assistants into dazed shadows of themselves. Still, in a world full of crocodile bites and scorching sun, a little controlled chaos wasn't just accepted, it was sanctified. Now take a breath, because in the next chamber of this ancient evening, you find something richer, darker, and a little more seductive. What? You might imagine tall glasses and gentle toasts, but Egyptian wine had a wilder agenda. It was a symbol of refinement, yes, tied to Osiris and sacred ceremonies. But beneath the surface of those clay amphorae was something more experimental. These weren't just drinks, they were potions. Fermented grape juice infused with blue lotus, myrrh, frankincense, and sometimes more daring companions like mandrake. Spiritual enhancement? Sure. Mood altering? Absolutely. Festivals became laboratories for these sacred brews. The feast of drunkenness wasn't about sipping with elegance. It was about plunging headfirst into altered states. The goal wasn't to get tipsy. It was to dance the line between dimensions, sometimes literally, alongside leopard-cloaked priests under star-stained skies. Medical scrolls, ever helpful, framed these wines as remedies. Got pain? Wine with lotus. Aches? Wine with resin. Existential dread? That needed supervision. And perhaps a very understanding floor. Even the gods didn't abstain. Temples poured wine as offerings, tombs stored it as travel supplies for the afterlife, and ceremonies invoked the divine through sips meant to awaken statues, or at least make them seem like they were nodding back. And the effect? These wines could numb pain, open minds, or launch a religious celebration into full visionary wonder. But since it was all wrapped in ritual, no one questioned the outcome. If the walls pulsed with light, it was a sacred sign. If your legs buckled in the lotus garden, you were communing with the divine. Because in Egypt, wine wasn't just refreshment. It was a vessel, a vehicle to float you through healing, to transport you through sorrow, or to carry you into the mystery of divine communion. And somehow, through all this, the discipline, the geometry, the reverence for order, Egypt still made space for surrender, for trance, for walking the razor's edge between logic and the unknown. Just not during accounting. So as your eyes grow heavier and the incense of thought fades to gray, let yourself be carried. Maybe by poppy dreams, maybe by fermented revelations, maybe just by curiosity, because tonight you've sipped from the same cup as a pharaoh. You've walked through sacred smoke and stared into the stillness of ancient wonder. And now you rest in a temple that still breathes in your sleep. You close your eyes and the world around you softens. The walls of your room blur into pillars of stone. Incense begins to wind its way through your breath, and you're standing again in ancient Egypt. Only now, the air is electric. Something unseen is moving through the temple, through the bodies of dancers and priests alike. You aren't just watching history, you're standing in the moment when the divine speaks through flesh. You see a woman in trance, trembling to the rhythm of drums, arms lifted skyward. She isn't escorted out. She's not whispered about. She's honored. Because in this moment, she's not simply a vessel. She's a channel. The goddess Hathor has arrived, they say. And apparently, Hathor has some thoughts about tambourine tempo. In Egypt, these altered states weren't cause for concern. They were spiritual promotions. Possession wasn't feared, it was embraced. Trances were carefully cultivated through a sacred recipe. Repetitive drumming, hypnotic chanting, thick incense smoke, wine laced with herbal mysteries, and the occasional absence of sleep. The result? Sudden prophecies, wide-eyed declarations, and dramatic collapses on temple floors. Not symptoms, signals. Priests and priestesses were trained not just to perform rituals, but to host the divine. Like cosmic bed and breakfast managers, they welcomed deities into their bodies during ceremony. Voices changed, eyes widened, posture shifted, and soon, cryptic truths poured out of their mouths like firelight through smoke. To modern minds, it might have looked like chaos. To the Egyptians, it was sacred theater, and the gods were the stars. Sometimes those gods arrived with wisdom, sometimes with warnings, sometimes with odd requests for more cake. And if someone wasn't ready for possession, it didn't matter. The gods chose whom they wished, and the signs, shaking limbs, shouted riddles, eyes rolling skyward, were received with awe, not alarm. Sure, modern scholars debate whether these divine episodes were the result of spirituality or simply 4 hours of deep incense inhalation beside an open flame. But in Egypt, the effect mattered more than the cause. When the spirit departed, the chosen would return from their trance, drenched in sweat, dazed, but somehow different. The ritual ended with reverent applause, a sip of wine, and often a well-earned nap behind a pillar. You might think that would be the end of the celebration, but not in Egypt, because the dead, they were still on the guest list. The line between the living and the departed wasn't a line at all. It was a curtain, gently swaying in the breeze. Festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley brought entire families into tomb courtyards with baskets of food, flasks of beer, and the same casual joy you might bring to a backyard barbecue. Only this party happened in a necropolis. They gathered not to mourn, but to reconnect. Meals were eaten outside tomb entrances. Songs were sung to stone. Toasts were made in the name of long-past grandmothers who, according to belief, were listening from just beyond the veil. False doors carved into tomb walls served as spiritual gateways, allowing the senses to pass through even if the body could not. And so they feasted. They burned incense. They poured libations. They laughed, sometimes wept, and occasionally had one drink too many and mistook a statue for Uncle Horm. It wasn't just commemoration, it was conversation. The dead could bless the crops, grant protection, and even send messages through dreams. Some family members even slept overnight by the tomb, hoping for advice from beyond, like which cousin not to lend money to. To you, it might sound eerie, but to them, it was logic. Death wasn't an ending. It was just relocation. If Great Aunt Satra wanted to make her presence known through a whiff of kiffy smoke and a dream about scarabs, you listened and maybe brought better wine next time. But with every feast, every ecstatic ritual, there came a reckoning. Even in a land where beer was breakfast and lotus was therapy, the morning after was very real. The sacred hangover hit hard. Ancient scrolls don't detail much, possibly because writing hieroglyphs while your head feels like it was trampled by divine hooves wasn't a priority. But signs of recovery rituals remain. Herbal remedies, honey-sweetened tonics, and the universal cure. Lying very still and blaming the gods for everything. In more serious cases, a priest might prescribe ritual cleansing. Cold Nile water, a stern chant, maybe a symbolic slap of moderation. But by then, the sacred reveler was usually too busy trying to remember why they were shouting at a statue the night before. Still, it was worth it, because these moments of divine disorientation weren't indulgence. They were devotion. They allowed the Egyptians to step beyond themselves, beyond their pain, beyond time. And in that liminal space between trance and clarity, between this world and the next, they found something we still chase today: connection. So as you slip into sleep now, remember, what looks like chaos from the outside might just be the soul's way of dancing with something eternal. You're not drifting off. You're stepping into ceremony. And the gods, they're still watching, still listening. And if you dream a little too vividly tonight, don't worry. You're just attending another feast. You awaken on cool stone, the scent of incense clinging to your skin, and a vague memory of dancing under torchlight with someone you're pretty sure was either a priest or the god Hathor in disguise. But you don't say you fainted. You say you were touched by the divine. Because in Egypt, spiritual enlightenment came with side effects: disorientation, tremors, and occasional floor naps behind sacred pillars. And if things got truly out of hand, well, there was always a cure, or rather a purge. You'd be handed a bitter drink, thick, earthy, and as reassuring as a tax scroll, and told with absolute confidence, "This will restore your spiritual balance." Minutes later, your balance and your dignity were gone. These cleansing tonics, designed to evacuate every shadow of excess from both ends of the body, weren't punishment. They were purification. The gods had a sense of humor, apparently. The priests, of course, handled these sacred substances more gracefully. They had training, they had status, and more importantly, they had assistants to carry them home. Meanwhile, the average reveler crawled out of temple alcoves at sunrise, with sandal prints on their cheek and blue lotus petals tangled in their hair, wondering whether they danced with a divine spirit or just an enthusiastic stranger in gold eyeliner. And yet, no one skipped the next celebration, because spiritual ecstasy was, in its own chaotic way, addictive. Something about the smoke, the chants, the sacred wine with questionable floaties. It made you believe the next ritual might just unlock a new truth, or at least reveal who's been stealing offerings from the temple pantry. But the Egyptian fascination with spiritual indulgence didn't end with life. It simply moved underground. Death, to them, wasn't a shutdown, it was a continuation, a different address. So the dead were prepared accordingly, not just with linen and prayers, but with provisions, snacks, sacred oils, blue lotus petals, wine jugs, and the occasional sealed jar that no one has dared open since, for fear of awakening a 1,000-year-old hangover. Take Tutankhamun, for instance. When his tomb was opened, they didn't just find gold. They found a carefully packed afterlife survival kit: oils, herbs, incense, and vintage wines, some still sealed. If that reminds you of a modern wellness influencer's nightstand, you're not wrong. The ancients knew that eternal life would require a few creature comforts, and possibly a spare bottle of mandrake wine, in case Osiris was in the mood to socialize. Instructions were even left behind, etched on tomb walls, on how to prepare these offerings in the afterlife. Because you couldn't just have the blue lotus. You needed to know how to soak it, steep it, inhale it properly. Divine memory, after all, might be short. And if you wanted to sip wine in the realm of eternity, you had to make sure your mouth was open. Hence the famous opening of the mouth ritual. Not just symbolic, practical. Because what good is a toast to the gods if your jaw won't move? This all paints a vivid picture. The Egyptians didn't separate delight from devotion. If something brought joy, comfort, or connection to the divine in this life, it was deemed worthy of carrying into the next. Wine, incense, flowers, tools of transcendence, both earthly and eternal. And this wasn't just limited to personal practice. It was woven into the fabric of power. You might imagine the pharaoh as the supreme figure, the walking Horus, keeper of cosmic order. But in reality, it was often the priests who held the true keys. They ran the temple apothecaries. They managed the incense stockpiles. They knew which herbs calmed the heart, which oils stirred visions, and how to measure the precise dose of mandrake without triggering an unplanned reincarnation. They weren't just spiritual guides, they were pharmacists of the sacred. Their rituals weren't simply poetic, they were pharmacological performances. If something tingled, burned, or made you speak in riddles for 3 days, it probably passed through a priest's hands first. And that came with influence. People didn't ask, "How are the crops?" They asked, "What did the high priest see in his dream?" And the answer, more often than not, involved birds, golden light, and a vague recommendation to plant more barley. But temples weren't just places of worship. They were economic engines. They owned land, employed laborers, oversaw harvests, and managed the cultivation and preparation of sacred substances. Blue lotus didn't harvest itself. Frankincense didn't ferment in a vacuum. Behind the chants and rituals was a complex system. Part monastery, part factory, part pharmacy. Running quietly, powerfully, and just mysteriously enough to keep everyone listening. So now, as your breath slows and the smoke of memory begins to curl around you once more, ask yourself, what if the sacred wasn't meant to be separate from the sensory? What if divinity came not in silence, but in song, in scent, in the warm haze of sacred wine? Tonight, you've stepped into the sanctuary of sensation. You've walked through festivals of trance, partied with the dead, and peeked into tombs that smell like spice and eternity. And as you drift into your own dreams, know this. In ancient Egypt, sleep was never just rest. It was a doorway. You drift deeper now, past the torches and chants, into the hushed machinery behind ancient Egypt's spiritual glow. You're no longer just an observer of temples and rituals, you're backstage, where sacred visions were brewed like tea and enlightenment had a recipe, where everything holy was also incredibly well organized. Because behind every divine possession, every prophetic trance, someone was working. Someone harvested the blue lotus at dawn, whispered blessings to it under the right moon phase, dried it gently in temple courtyards, and steeped it into offerings measured not just by volume, but by vibration. In Egypt, religion wasn't chaos. It was a sacred system, part theater, part pharmacology, part poetic logistics. And at the center of it all wasn't the throne. It was the incense burner. You see, control didn't always flow from the golden crown. It often rose from the temple chambers, where visions were sparked by smoke and divine inspiration came in sealed ceramic jars. If a priest stepped into the sanctuary, inhaled a pungent blend of frankincense, myrrh, and possibly something imported from the eastern hills, and then proclaimed he'd spoken to Horus, that wasn't eccentricity. That was policy. Yes, Egypt's core principle was balance, justice, order, ma'at. But in practice, let's just say your access to sacred experiences often depended on your social rank and your budget. If you had the luxury of a personal tomb, linen pillows, and someone to fan you while you digested your honey-glazed quail, you also had access to the enhanced rituals, the kind of oils and infusions that didn't make it into the village pharmacy. While commoners made do with barley beer and the occasional temple whiff of kiffy if they stood close enough, the upper class indulged in psychotropic wines, imported cannabis resins, and mandrake-laced rituals administered by trained hands. The divide was spiritual, yes, but it was also economic. This sacred hierarchy trickled all the way up to the pharaoh. The divine ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt wasn't just basking in cosmic light. He was drinking herbal concoctions designed to coax dreams straight from the gods. And if his dreams shaped policy, then soothing his mind before bed wasn't luxury. It was national security. And when these rulers were buried, the rituals didn't stop. The tombs of kings and priests weren't silent crypts. They were continuity plans, stocked with incense cones, unlabeled oils, and mood-altering petals sealed in jars marked for ceremonial use. Whether those were divine tools or secret indulgences. Well, maybe both. Meanwhile, the laborers who carved these tombs didn't go empty-handed. They had their own versions of transcendence. Thick beer like fermented oatmeal, smoke-lighted ceremonies at dusk, and whispered prayers under the stars. It wasn't about escaping reality. It was about surviving it with grace, even if your path to the afterlife included a little less opium and a bit more back pain. And heaven forbid a commoner accessed something restricted. That wasn't seen as curiosity, it was labeled heresy, witchcraft, or worse. Sacred plants were for the initiated. Unauthorized enlightenment? That could get you more than a slap on the wrist. You might be sentenced to purification rituals so aggressive they made vomiting look elegant. But what does all this reveal? That Egypt, so often mythologized as a kingdom of cold stone and solemn gods, was also profoundly human. Brilliant, yes. Spiritual, certainly. But also full of laughter, mischief, indulgence, and incredible awareness of what it meant to live with both pain and mystery. Their temples were not just altars. They were laboratories of the soul. They understood that prophecy and pain relief could come from the same plant. That a vision might follow a ritual or a cup of fortified wine. That altered states were not weaknesses, but tools, gateways to something larger, softer, and more forgiving. Their ceremonies? Carefully choreographed chemical plays, with incense clouds, drumbeats, and psychotropic teas swirling through every act. But entry required access, and access came with wealth, birthright, or divine favor. So yes, the elite had their sacred spa days, blue lotus baths, pomegranate wine infusions, imported herbs served on ivory trays. The rest received tepid beer, sand-scraped eyelids, and occasional nightmares about crocodile gods with dental issues. And yet, somehow, everyone was reaching for the same thing. To feel more, to know more, to connect. That's the heart of it. Because whether you were a priest lighting sacred incense, or a stonemason sipping beer after dusk, the yearning was the same. A desire to understand the mystery, to draw close to the divine, to lay under stars carved into temple ceilings and believe, just for a moment, that the gods were listening. Sound familiar? It should. You might not wear linen robes or chant in unison, but you burn candles, chase visions, scroll endlessly in search of meaning. You listen to stories like these, hoping for something deeper than data, something real. So as you lie there now, nestled between the past and the pulse of your own dreams, let this truth settle gently into your mind. The Egyptians weren't primitive. They weren't naive. They were seekers, just like you, just like all of us, using the tools they had, the herbs, the rhythms, the sacred recipes, to lift the veil between the seen and the unseen. And if that journey sometimes involved a little too much wine, some flower petals, and a tendency to bark like Anubis mid-trance, well, maybe that was just part of the process. Sleep well, traveler. The gods have always understood the power of a good story told in the dark. You awaken in the glow of candlelight, where stone walls flicker with shadows and every breath feels perfumed with rosewater and something darker beneath. You're not in a temple now, you're in a Renaissance dressing room. The world smells like powdered skin and ambition. The mirror is nowhere to be found, and you're about to become art. You see, in Renaissance Italy, beauty wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a declaration, a political statement, a social ladder rung. The paler your skin, the more powerful your message. I do not labor. I do not toil. I am above the sun itself. And to prove it, noble women reached for their most precious weapon, cerussa, a lustrous, silky white paint made from actual lead. Yes, real lead. Women painted their faces, necks, and shoulders in thick layers of this poison. Not just a dusting. Think plaster, not powder. Some even slept in it, day after day, until the lead soaked through the skin, reaching the bloodstream like a whisper of death disguised as radiance. And when sores emerged, as they inevitably did, more lead, a fresh coat, like spackling a wall instead of treating the crack. The effect, a smooth, ghost-like glow that shimmered beneath velvet veils and candlelight, until it peeled. And the dangers didn't stop there. Mercury joined the ritual to erase blemishes, while arsenic and vinegar bathed the skin in burning promises of clarity. What began as beauty became slow alchemy, transmutation of the self into sickness. But of course, the fragrance masked the rot. These were women who smelled divine, distilled rosewater, camphor tinctures, imported perfumes from the east. Their skin may have blistered beneath the powder, but they moved through the halls like living saints, pale, perfumed, and powerful. And if you think that was the worst of it, wait until we get to the eyebrows. In Renaissance Florence, a visible brow meant you'd missed the memo. A high, smooth forehead was the true crown. So women plucked, obsessively, pulling hairs from their eyebrows and along the hairline to give the face that coveted intelligent dome. This wasn't a one-time ritual. It was weekly warfare against hair. The tools? Tweezers, rough cloth, seashells. And for stubborn follicles? Walnut oil, cat dung, candle flames. Yes, you heard right. Burning off facial hair was considered an acceptable act of refinement. And once the real eyebrows were gone, a trace of illusion was brushed back on, often with burnt cork or charcoal. It seemed elegant, until a hot summer's day at Mass revealed your brows slowly dripping down your cheeks. And it didn't stop at the face. Body hair, too, was the enemy. It was seen as a sign of animal instinct, impure and uncivilized. So women applied pastes made of vinegar, arsenic, and quicklime, a cocktail of pain. The result? Smooth skin until the burns surfaced. Meanwhile, hairstyles were anything but relaxed. The hair was braided, patted, stuffed with wool or horsehair, or simply borrowed from another woman's head entirely. If the shade didn't match the season's golden trend, you bleached it with lye. And if it still didn't work, you wore a cap and lied about it. Renaissance problem solving. Now imagine doing all of this without a mirror. Most women couldn't afford one. They relied on feel or on servants, whose hands had better be steady, gentle, and utterly devoid of sarcasm. A single slip, and your noble widow's peak became a medieval bowl cut. Beauty back then was sculpted blindly, a leap of faith, layered in powder and pain. And when the face was set and the hair pinned high, it was time to armor the body. The Renaissance corset, called stays or bodies, wasn't designed to shape the waist yet. That came later. These were about flattening the torso into a smooth, controlled canvas. Rigid and upright, the ideal woman looked less like a flower and more like an upright lute. A noble silhouette wasn't supposed to curve. It was supposed to rise long, lean, and morally upright. Literally. The corset was stiffened with baleen if you were wealthy, pasteboard if you weren't. Sewn into linen, laced tightly, often requiring two people just to get you inside. Peripheral vision, sacrificed. Breathing deeply, optional. But you looked correct. Straight posture meant inner virtue. Elegance wasn't just style. It was discipline. In the end, Renaissance beauty was never about ease. It was about effort. About subtracting anything that looked natural and replacing it with studied control. You removed your brows, your hairline, your comfort, sometimes even your health, all in the name of divine appearance, of becoming the painting, the symbol, the illusion of perfection. So tonight, as you drift into dreams, imagine standing in the candlelit halls of Florence or Venice, your skin glowing white beneath layers of silk and lead, your hair shaped like a golden halo, your waist bound tight and your soul stretched thinner. And yet you walk with grace, because that's what beauty demanded. Not ease, but endurance. And now you rest, unbound, unpainted, free from the rituals of bone and powder. But as you close your eyes, part of you still walks those stone corridors, where beauty was pain, and pain was the price of becoming divine. You stand there now, corseted and powdered, surrounded by the golden flicker of oil lamps and the distant echo of lute strings in a Florentine salon. Your breath is shallow, not by choice, but by design. In Renaissance society, posture wasn't just etiquette, it was morality. A straight spine whispered of virtue. A slouch? A scandal. Or worse, a sign of spiritual decay. You were taught early, Elegance demands stillness. Stillness demands sacrifice. The corset, your second ribcage, held you upright like a cathedral pillar. You walked like marble. You breathed in delicate sips. And if you fainted mid-conversation, congratulations. You'd achieved aesthetic excellence. Beneath your gown, fine linen shifts clung to your skin. They weren't luxurious, they were practical. Florence in summer was a furnace, but sweating openly was forbidden. These inner garments absorbed the evidence, while your outer layers remained pristine. Comfort, of course, was never invited, but control was everything. And though the corset was an unyielding prison, it offered one quiet triumph: absolute stillness. You could move, dance, even collapse dramatically without a single thread shifting. Unlike modern garments that betray you by lunchtime, Renaissance stays offered the structural integrity of a Roman aqueduct. For noble women, they were non-negotiable. Without one, you weren't underdressed, you were undone. But corsets didn't just shape your body, they shaped your appetite. Imagine sitting down at a banquet, candles glowing, silverware glinting, tables groaning under the weight of roasted peacocks, jeweled marzipan, and gilded figs. Now imagine trying to eat it all while your midsection is wrapped tighter than a wine barrel. You could sip, you could nibble, but biting into a goose leg with abandon? Unthinkable. Women were expected to eat with the grace of a whisper. Dainty portions, immaculate posture, and the kind of restraint that left your stomach begging for mercy. Long meals, cold pies, and relentless conversation meant that fainting wasn't just likely, it was fashionable. Swoon into a courtier's arms mid-course, and you'd be the talk of the week. A pale, breathless beauty, undone by an eel tart. Divine. But hunger is human. So when the guests dispersed, and the servants drew the curtains, the noblewoman would retreat to her private chambers, unlacing her stays like a prisoner freed. And there, far from the judgment of candlelight and company, she'd reach for her stash. Sweetmeats, cheese, whatever lingered from the feast. Midnight indulgence was her secret ritual. Of course, even snacks had social rules. Cucumbers? Forbidden, they were said to weaken the complexion. Wine? Encouraged for a healthy blush. Vinegar tonics were common among the fashion-obsessed, promising trim figures while eroding stomach linings. Digestion itself was an ordeal. With every organ compressed, even a small meal could result in bloating or worse, a burp. Unladylike, unforgivable. While men reclined, gestured wildly, and debated Dante between mouthfuls, women perfected the silent ballet of suppression. They ate just enough to be sociable, never enough to risk the silhouette. And after food came the final flourish, scent. In the Renaissance, fragrance wasn't a luxury. It was status. Your perfume was a declaration, carefully crafted and impossible to ignore. A noblewoman's scent lingered like a signature. If she passed you in the corridor and your senses didn't tilt sideways, she wasn't trying hard enough. Commoners carried the weight of garlic, goats, and the unforgiving streets. But nobility? They trailed clouds of rosewater, musk, ambergris, and exotic spices. These perfumes weren't just for the skin. They were stitched into dress linings, soaked into gloves, and misted across handkerchiefs, ready to be fluttered with strategic disgust when the air turned peasant. The ingredients, as distant and rare as the ambitions they represented. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from East Africa, cinnamon from distant Ceylon, and ambergris, a strange, waxy treasure born from the depths of the sea, extracted from the bellies of whales and transformed into sweet-smelling elegance. Costly, coveted, the Renaissance version of designer indulgence. And so, the final image is complete. The powdered face, the painted brows, the ironclad torso, the whispered meal, and the perfume that declared your place in the world without speaking a word. It was never just about looking beautiful. It was about being beautiful through pain, silence, and orchestration. And now, as you slip beneath your blanket in this modern world of soft pajamas and open windows, take one last breath of that perfumed air. Let the echo of those salons fade gently in your mind. The rustle of linen, the press of the corset, the sweet ache of restraint. Because in that flickering past, beauty was never natural. It was built, layer by layer. And you've walked through it ghost-like, a silent witness to elegance, endurance, and the quiet rebellion hidden in every painted smile. You take a slow breath now, one last inhale before sleep, and it carries you into another world entirely. One laced not with dreams, but with perfume. Thick, layered, and calculated, Renaissance scent wasn't a finishing touch. It was a strategy, a mask, a message. You didn't just smell good, you announced yourself. You began with a rinse in rosewater or camphor, cleansing away the day's grime and resetting your elegance. Then, a delicate dusting of crushed violet petals along the shoulders and décolletage. Next, fragrant oils rubbed into the temples and wrists, pulse points made into power points. And finally, a generous cloud of your most potent potion. Something your apothecary swore could break hearts and silence rivals. Not always subtle, not always safe. You might carry your scent in a pomander, a delicate, filigreed orb filled with dried herbs, hung from a silk cord at your waist or neck. Like a fragrant alarm bell, it warned the room before you entered. Cinnamon, clove, and a hint of intimidation. These perfumes were bold declarations, but behind their allure hid danger. Some mixtures contained turpentine, others tinctures strong enough to turn flirtation into fainting. A single wrong blend could ruin a salon or a reputation, but the right fragrance, it could shift a conversation or a marriage proposal in your favor. And if scent was your shield, fashion was your battleground. In Renaissance Florence, your dress didn't whisper, it shouted. Silk screamed status. Brocade boasted influence. Velvet was practically divine. Heavy, rich, and unbearably hot in summer, it was the uniform of the powerful. If you could survive velvet in July, you were either wealthy or nearly mummified from heatstroke. But the crown jewel of fashion? Sleeves. Yes, sleeves. They were detachable and they were everything. Noble women collected them like treasure. Embroidered, puffed, slashed, beaded sleeves weren't just additions. They were statements. You could change your entire ensemble with a new pair. Some were so elaborate they needed their own chests, and occasionally their own maids to manage them. It was the Renaissance handbag war, only with fabric and pearls. And color? That wasn't a casual choice either. Deep blue required crushed lapis lazuli, crimson came from rare beetles, and both were locked behind wealth and, often, sumptuary laws meant to keep commoners modest. Laws were made. Laws were ignored. Because when fashion is your weapon, rules are only as strong as the silk thread holding them. Even the layers you didn't see were laced with opulence. Linen shifts edged in lace. Petticoats that whispered beneath every step. Girdles, jeweled belts that cinched the waist and hid perfumes, charms, and the occasional love note or whispered curse. The gown itself, worth more than a year's income for a skilled craftsman. But for noble women, it wasn't optional. Repeating an outfit to 2 events? Social disaster. And then, just when you thought no one could see more, it came down to the feet. Welcome to the world of Chopins. Born in Venice, these towering platform shoes began with practical intentions, raising hems above the sewage-slick streets. But function surrendered to fashion, and soon, some reached over 20 inches high. That's right, 20. Walking without help was discouraged, even dangerous. You needed balance. You needed training. You needed servants. One wrong step and you didn't just trip, you took out the orchestra. Florentine women embraced the style more modestly. Indoors, they wore velvet slippers, embroidered with silk and lined with fur. Outdoors, protective pattens, wood or cork platforms strapped underneath to keep their delicate shoes safe from the unforgiving streets. Still, the footwear was impractical by design. Narrow, pointed, and never meant for real walking. Because a lady didn't walk. She glided, from carriage to palace, from salon to sanctuary. Her feet, wrapped in silk stockings tied with scented ribbons, weren't meant to be seen. But if, heaven forbid, a glimpse of her ankle did flash during a gust of wind or a misstep, at least it would smell like rosewater and status. Meanwhile, women of lower rank wore sturdier shoes, leather clogs for work, practical heels for the marketplace. They moved with purpose, not poise. Their clothing followed need, not pageantry. But for the noble class, every detail, every button, scent, and stitch was a performance. A spectacle meant to be noticed, even if it meant suffering. So now, as you lie still beneath the safety of modern cotton and a breathable blanket, reflect on this. The Renaissance wasn't just painted ceilings and poetry. It was pain wrapped in velvet. It was power stitched into seams. It was women holding their breath, literally, while their clothing declared their worth. And you've walked among them tonight, heard their footsteps echoing across marble floors, felt the weight of their sleeves, the heat of their velvet, the sting of their vinegar tonics. And you've breathed in their world, heavy with perfume, with pride, and with possibility. Now let it drift away. Close your eyes and dream not just of beauty, but of the strength it took to wear it. You close your eyes, and the echo of the lute fades. The last candle flickers low. You've danced your part, survived the glances, the whispered critiques, the suffocating perfection. But now, back in your chamber, the real ritual begins. Not of beauty, but of unbecoming. You've spent the evening floating, not walking, gliding, not breathing, wrapped in 20 pounds of velvet and brocade, laced into a corset that has reshaped your ribs and your resolve. You've smiled through dizziness and danced through discomfort. Renaissance court dances weren't joyful expressions. They were a test, a language of footsteps and posture. Every glide whispered status. Every misstep murmured scandal. You learned the dances young, not to delight but to survive. The pavan demanded poise. The galliard controlled energy, a leap balanced against the tight squeeze of your stays. There was no room for laughter, no room for deep breaths. The court watched. Women judged. Men measured. Parents hoped. Every movement calculated diplomacy. Every turn potential elevation or humiliation. And so you learned to nod just enough, to fan yourself with the flick of a wrist that said, "I'm composed," not "I'm melting." You touched gloved hands, shared stolen glances, mingled perfumes. Never too forward, never too cold. Flirtation was a choreography of restraint. Say too much or smile too wide, and the illusion cracked. Behind every gown stood the threat of judgment, not just from courtiers but from servants, tutors, rivals. Your very survival at court depended on the illusion that it was all effortless, that your blistered feet and bruised ribs were part of some divine elegance you were born into. But once the music faded and the guests trickled out into the night, you could finally disappear, quietly, carefully, back to your room where beauty's mask could begin to dissolve. The night ritual wasn't restful. It was controlled collapse. First, the unmasking. Out came the cloths, the rosewater, the egg whites. Sarusa, your lead-laced facade, had to be wiped gently, not because the skin underneath was soft, but because it was already breaking. Scrubbed too hard, and you took more than makeup off. You whispered a prayer as you dabbed at your cheeks, hoping your complexion hadn't deteriorated too much under the day's glamour. Almond oil and vinegar helped, sometimes. The mirror, if you had one, told a complicated truth. Then came the hair, or what was left of it. Wigs unpinned, braids unwound, any adhesive softened with tonics. You tugged gently, bracing for strands that came out too easily. You tried not to count them. You tried not to think of the cat dung paste you'd used earlier that week or the quicklime. You told yourself the patchiness was just temporary, that beauty was worth the risk. Next, the corset. Unlacing wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. You exhaled for the first time all day. Your ribs expanded with a gasp that sounded like freedom or defeat. Sometimes it came with a faint pop, as cartilage remembered its original place. You leaned against the wall, murmured "never again," and prepared to do it again tomorrow. You peeled off slippers, revealing crushed toes, angry welts, and the faint tremble of feet too long confined. If you were fortunate, your servant brought warm water with lavender. If not, you simply stared at your feet and wondered how they ever danced. Finally, your body was anointed sweet oils or strange tonics. One promised youth, another divine favor. Most smelled like boiled herbs and wishful thinking. You didn't question the ingredients. You just hoped they worked. And then, at last, the final breath. The candle extinguished not with a huff improper, but with a soft puff, like you were apologizing to the flame for everything it had seen. You lay back, hairline pulled a little farther back than last year, skin a shade paler, lungs tentative, your heart still rehearsing dance steps in your chest. And yet, you knew, tomorrow it would begin again. Because in Renaissance Florence, beauty wasn't a moment. It was maintenance. It was performance. It was a full-time occupation with no intermission, no mercy, and no margin for failure. You didn't sleep. You recharged for another day of shaping yourself into art, for another performance where the audience was everyone. And so, as your breath slows and your body softens, carry with you the quiet power of that performance. Not just the pain of it, but the resilience, the whispered strength in every bowed head, every unspoken discomfort, every smile behind the powder. Because those women didn't just wear beauty, they survived it. You close your eyes and drift beyond the powdered courts of Florence, past the scent of rose oil and the rustle of brocade, into another world. One where ink, not silk, defines identity. The air shifts. Now you stand beneath paper lanterns, in the back alleys of Edo period Japan, where beauty moved not through perfume, but through pain. Where storytelling wasn't spoken, it was carved into skin. Here, status wore armor made of pigment. And for those without swords, without silks, without sanctioned power, the body became the only canvas left. In a society where everything was controlled, your class, your clothing, even the fabric you were allowed to wear, there was still one place no law could fully reach: the skin beneath your robe. Tattoos, Irizumi, began as branding, punishment, criminal marks burned into flesh to exile you from society. But over time, something changed. These scars became symbols. Symbols evolved into art. And for the working class, laborers, firemen, gamblers, this forbidden ink became sacred. If you couldn't wear embroidered dragons on your sleeves, you became the dragon. If the law banned luxurious robes, you etched their likeness onto your back. In bathhouses, at festivals, and in moments of quiet intimacy, men revealed what society told them to hide. Not random designs, legends. A koi battling the current, symbolizing resilience. A phoenix rising through flame. Bodhisattvas and deities, cherry blossoms and waves. Each one a myth. Each line a chapter. Each tattoo earned. The process was nothing short of ritual. There were no humming machines, no sterile cream. Only wooden handles and steel-tipped needles wielded by masters known as horishi. They worked by hand, rhythmically tapping ink beneath the skin using charcoal or earth-toned pigments. Each session lasted hours. Each full-body piece, months, years even. The pain was part of it, part of the transformation. If you could endure that, what couldn't you face? But Irizumi wasn't just outlawed by skin, it was outlawed by society. The ruling Tokugawa elite viewed it as dangerous, indulgent, disorderly. It threatened the neatness of the social hierarchy. So the tattoos lived underground, hidden by day, revealed in secret. They were protection, resistance, a kind of quiet, radiant rebellion. Nowhere was this defiance more admired than among Edo's fire brigades, the Haikshire. In a city of wooden houses and open flame, fire wasn't just danger. It was constant reality. The samurai protected the order. But when the inferno came, it was the Haikshire who climbed onto blazing rooftops and tore down homes by hand, sacrificing entire blocks to save a neighborhood. They didn't have helmets or hoses. They had axes, ropes, and courage that bordered on madness. But underneath their plain uniforms, they wore their true armor, full-body Irizumi, dragons for strength, tigers for fearlessness, Shinto gods etched across ribs, flames tattooed across shoulders. The firemen stripped off their robes not to show off, but to remind the flames and each other who they were. Men who embraced pain, men who didn't flinch. Each drop of ink was a badge of devotion, not just to self, but to the crew. Some brigades even shared motifs, matched dragons, synchronized waves, identical masks of deities. It wasn't gang identity, it was brotherhood, a visual oath worn beneath the skin. And still, it was illegal. Officially, these tattoos were shameful, too indulgent, too unruly for public servants. But in the streets, among neighbors, the hikesher were heroes. Their ink, a whispered contradiction, feared by authorities, revered by the people. And it wasn't just the firemen who carried this quiet defiance. In the shadow world of Edo, drifting through gambling dens and tea-house alleyways, another tribe flourished. Bakudo, the gamblers, rogues, and thrill-seekers who lived in the Ukiyo, the floating world, a realm of fleeting pleasure and poetic impermanence. These men didn't wear their hearts on their sleeves. They wore their stories on their skin. Their tattoos told of danger, of dreams, of a life not lived by rules but by instinct. They gambled not just with dice, but with their bodies, their reputations, their place in a rigid society. In a world that limited what they could say or do, tattoos became their unspoken manifesto. Because Irizumi was more than decoration. It was declaration. It was choosing pain over invisibility. It was reclaiming beauty in a world that said you didn't deserve it. And as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet rhythm of the Horoshi's needle, the steady breath of the client, unmoving beneath the pain. Picture skin turning to canvas, stories blooming like flames, courage inked into ribs, identity pressed into flesh, all beneath a world that never dared to look close enough. This wasn't vanity. This was memory, ritual, legacy. And even now, if you close your eyes and listen, you can almost hear the sound of ink being hammered into history, one heartbeat at a time. You enter the dimly lit corners of Edo's underworld, where names aren't always spoken, but identities are worn on skin. You walk past the laughter of gamblers, the hush of geishas, the whisper of silk against inked flesh, and in that moment, you realize something. In this world, the tattoo wasn't just a design. It was destiny, rebellion, and raw survival stitched together in black and crimson lines. You meet the Bakudo, gamblers by trade, outsiders by design. No official titles, no aristocratic honors, just their own codes. Loyalty, endurance, and pride. Their lives were risky, their incomes uncertain, but their sense of dignity, unshakable. In a world that pushed them to the margins, they turned their own bodies into declarations. You won't give me a name? I'll carve my own, one mark at a time. Their tattoos weren't whispered about, they were roared into existence. Fierce gods of luck, serpents curled in defiance, warriors from ancient tales, mythic rebels who spat in the face of hierarchy, etched across torsos and limbs like visual proclamations. I follow no one's rules but my own. Kabuki heroes and folkloric fighters inspired these designs. Bold, defiant figures who challenged the system and lived loud. In a society that rarely gave second chances, these men turned pain into power. Tattoos weren't just vanity, they were validation. A body full of ink was proof that you'd endured, that you belonged to something, even if it wasn't written in any scroll. And in the smoky rooms where dice clattered and sake flowed, the true artists thrived. The Horoshi, the tattoo masters. They didn't advertise. You found them through whispers in bathhouses, secrets passed behind fans, murmured legends over firelight. To be inked by one of them was to wear greatness beneath your robe. It was status, not one granted by class, but by blood, pain, and patience. Yet tattooing wasn't just a man's world. In the hush between temple bells and the rustle of silk, women were getting inked too, quietly, tenderly, sometimes rebelliously. You see, love in Edo wasn't always bound in rings or signed on parchment. For many, it was written in ink, Irizumi Chobun, love tattoos. Names inked onto the inner arm, the ribcage, the collarbone. Places only lovers could see. One of the most tender vows? Inochi Azukasu, I entrust you with my life. Not just whispered in the dark, but etched permanently into flesh. Among the Ukiyo, the floating world of courtesans and pleasure districts, tattoos became a kind of theater. A delicate symbol barely visible as a robe slipped open, the illusion of intimacy. Clients believed they were glimpsing a hidden truth, unaware the same ink had been shown to dozens before. Illusion, mystery, control. Sometimes heartbreak left its mark too. A name turned to scar, then to phoenix. A past lover consumed by a dragon's tail or washed away by curling waves. And beyond the courtesans, you find the quiet revolutionaries. Peasant women, fisher wives, the overlooked and the overworked, slipping away to have their own tattoos. Small, sacred, hidden. Maybe it was love. Maybe solidarity. Maybe they just wanted to feel like they owned something in a world that claimed everything else. These stories of gamblers, lovers, rebels, and wives only came to life through the hands of the Horishi. Not simply artists, storytellers, psychologists, alchemists of skin and ink. They worked in silence. No glowing signs, no menus, just knowledge passed through generations. Apprentices spent years mastering the tools. Wooden shafts, steel needles bound together and dipped in sumi. A thick ink made from soot and animal glue. The technique? Ancient and grueling. A bamboo mallet tapped the needle cluster into skin, beat by beat, line by line. This was teburi, a rhythm of pain and patience, requiring hands steady enough for surgery and hearts strong enough for secrets. They weren't just creating images. They were preserving myths, recording dreams, listening to the unspoken cries of a client and turning them into silent strength. Because in Edo, to be tattooed was to be seen, if not by the law, then by your own kind. And so you close your eyes now, imagining the lantern glow bouncing off lacquered tables, the hum of a mallet hitting skin, the deep breath taken just before the needle touches down. These weren't just inked bodies. They were walking manuscripts of pain, power, longing, defiance. And as sleep begins to settle, you realize something quietly profound. In a world that gave some people scrolls and others silence, tattoos gave the voiceless a voice. Not with words, but with art that bled. You find yourself in a candlelit room, where the only sounds are the rhythmic taps of bamboo on flesh and the slow exhale of someone learning to endure. This isn't just ink, it's initiation. You aren't just witnessing art, you're witnessing transformation. You learn quickly. A true Horishi wasn't just a craftsman. He was a philosopher with needles, a quiet cartographer mapping courage, grief, and longing across the human body. Clients didn't arrive with a simple request. They came carrying stories. A fading cherry blossom dissolving into waves wasn't just pretty. It whispered of life's fleeting beauty. A tiger clawing up a mountainside spoke of tenacity in the face of odds no one thought you'd overcome. Every stroke had soul, but only the master decided where that soul belonged. You come to understand the ritual. Clients would return week after week, year after year, surrendering themselves to the slow unfolding of a myth. These weren't scattered patches of art. They were bodysuits, living landscapes etched from shoulder to thigh, curling around spines, dancing across ribs, and tapering just before wrist or collar. Not out of modesty, but necessity. The law frowned upon what it could not control, so the ink stayed hidden beneath layers of fabric and composure. Yet, beneath the surface, secrets bloomed. Some Horishi hid their signature, tucked inside a dragon's tail, cradled in a lotus petal. You wouldn't see it unless you knew where to look. And those who knew, they carried it like a badge of belonging, a whisper of lineage. Because the world of tattooing lived at the edges, populated by firemen, gamblers, courtesans. So naturally, the artists who inked them lived there too, respected in shadows, feared in silence, invisible to those in power. You sit with the pain, because in Edo, Japan, the agony was not a side effect, it was the ceremony. This was teburi, a hand-driven art form of relentless taps, where steel needles were dipped in thick black sumi and hammered into skin with unwavering rhythm. No anesthetic, no machines, just endurance, repetition, and surrender. A single session might last half a day. A full suit? Years. And still, they came back. The pain became a kind of pride. Firefighters believed it built courage. Gamblers swore it tested fate. Lovers marked their hearts with it. For some, it was penance. For others, salvation. Pain wasn't just endured, it was chosen. It was discipline. It was silence made sacred. The themes reflected this. Buddhist imagery was carved deep into flesh, not just because it was beautiful, but because it told of suffering, impermanence, and awakening. Each puncture was another step toward becoming something more than human, more whole, more knowing. And there were unspoken rules. No flinching, no crying out. Even a shift could ruin the lines. It wasn't just about sitting still. It was about being worthy. Those who completed the full Munwari bodysuit were rare. The chest was often left blank, a quiet gesture of modesty, in case the robe slipped open, because ink was permanence. And in a world where silk declared class, tattoos declared truth. Every tattoo told a story, but not the kind spoken aloud. These were myths rendered in ink. Legends of koi pushing against the current, fighting toward transformation. In old lore, if a koi reached the top of the waterfall, it would become a dragon. And so, many wore that image across their backs. A personal saga of rising above the castes, defying what society said they were allowed to be. Dragons weren't fire-breathing beasts. They were guardians, cosmic protectors, wrapped in wind and water, woven into the world itself. A dragon wasn't there to frighten. It was there to shield, a constant presence between your bare skin and life's blades. Peonies bloomed with elegance and quiet bravery. Tigers crouched and leapt with ferocity and resolve. Waves surged and crashed, a reminder of life's endless motion and unpredictability. And then, there were the darker images, ghosts, demons, monsters. These weren't just for show. They were warnings, lessons carved permanently into flesh. Some even bore entire battle scenes. Tales of betrayal, war, and divine fury straight from Chinese and Japanese folklore. Among the most revered tales, the saga of the Suikoden, 108 outlaw heroes, warriors on the fringe who fought with honor but lived beyond the law. Rebels, yes, but not without code. These figures resonated with those who lived between shadows. Men and women who may not have been samurai, but lived with discipline all the same. Wrathful deities were common too. Take Fudo Mayu, for instance, the immovable one. With his sword raised and rope coiled, he bound evil and cut through illusion. To carry his image on your back was to walk with a spiritual bodyguard, a guardian who wouldn't hesitate to fight on your behalf. But here's what you come to learn. Tattoos weren't just about what was inked, but where. A tiger climbing up the back? That meant ambition, forward motion. A tiger crouching low, eyes locked forward? Caution. A storm gathering behind calm eyes. Placement mattered. Direction mattered. And nothing was random. Everything had weight, balance, rhythm. By now, you can almost feel the pulse beneath the skin, the heartbeat of meaning stitched with pain. Because in Edo, Japan, to wear ink was not just to decorate your body. It was to rewrite your place in the world. You walk through a quiet street just before sunrise, mist curling low around your ankles like forgotten dreams. In this fading silence, you realize something profound. Not all rebellions are loud. Some are inked, not shouted. Some live under the skin, waiting patiently to be understood. And in Edo, Japan, few things spoke louder in silence than Irizumi. You begin to notice that even the direction of a tattoo held meaning. A dragon coiled upward whispered of ambition and growth. One spiraling downward, a warning. Even the order in which the body was inked told a story, a timeline carved in flesh. Because in a world where words could be twisted, where silence often meant safety, tattoos became the purest form of truth. But time has a way of twisting even the truest things. As the Edo period moved into its later chapters, the once honorable symbols of ink began clashing with the tightening grip of the state. The hidden beauty cherished in bathhouses and tea houses, symbols of loyalty, courage, or love, was now being rebranded as dangerous. Suspicion rose like steam, and the same dragons that once symbolized guardianship were now seen as serpents of rebellion. At the center of this shift was fear from the ruling class. Tattooing had always been a quiet threat to rigid social order. But now, as groups like the Bakudo became more visible and organized, the ink on their bodies began to define them, not as men of principle, but as criminals. And as they evolved into more structured syndicates, society didn't just turn away. it recoiled. The irony? Many of these men wore tattoos not to incite fear, but to reclaim dignity. They weren't born with family crests or noble titles. They had to build identity with every line of ink. But once tattoos began to serve as visible membership marks in underground circles, public perception soured completely. The government didn't care if your koi meant endurance or your bodhisattva meant enlightenment. All they saw was a threat. So came the crackdown. By the early 19th century, tattooing wasn't just socially frowned upon, it was officially illegal. Enforcement varied, but the message was clear. Hide your ink or pay the price. Tattoo shops moved further into shadow. Appointments were made through coded words. Artists disguised their work within layers of visual trickery, blending symbols to mislead inspectors. Some ink was deliberately placed where it would remain unseen under clothing, safe from wandering eyes and judgment. The penalties weren't always legal, they were emotional, too. People with visible tattoos were denied entry to public baths, refused jobs, turned away from temples. Some were unable to marry into respectable families. And so, what was once seen as sacred, a wearable prayer, a rite of bravery, was now viewed as vulgar, shameful, even cursed. But it never truly vanished. It merely went underground like an ember waiting for breath. When Japan began reinventing itself during the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, the pressure to modernize brought even harsher rejection of Irezumi. The new government wanted to present an image of refinement and control to foreign eyes, particularly the West. And elaborate tattoos? They didn't fit the narrative. Officials labeled them savage, primitive, a mark of backwardness. Ironically, as Japan tried to erase its own inked history, foreign sailors arrived at its ports begging to bring that very same art home. British and American seamen lined up to be tattooed by Japan's hidden masters, taking with them koi, chrysanthemums, and dragons across oceans. The art form Japan tried to bury was being revived by the very outsiders it had sought to impress. And still, the masters adapted. The horoshi didn't disappear, they evolved. They moved deeper into secrecy, passed their knowledge down through whispers, from father to son, master to apprentice. The tebari method, hand-poked, mallet-tapped, soul-infused, survived in tucked-away corners of the city. But by the 20th century, something darker unfolded. Organized crime fully embraced the legacy of ink. The full-body suit returned, hidden beneath business suits, now no longer a tribute to fire gods or mythical carp, but a signal of silence, power, and unbreakable loyalty. The meaning had shifted, the poetry faded, fear took its place. Even now, the echo of that fear lingers. Modern Japan still carries the weight of those associations. Public pools, gyms, beaches. Many still turn away those with tattoos. And while global tattoo culture is booming, curiosity often collides with caution here. But the tide is changing. A new generation of artists is stepping forward, not to rebel, but to remember. They see Irezumi not as defiance, but as heritage. Museums now archive once forbidden designs. Scholars study its iconography. Young creatives wear it proudly, asking the question their ancestors couldn't. Why should we feel shame for beauty carved in courage? Because in a country built on layers, of language, of silence, of seasonal change, perhaps the most honest thing was never spoken. It was inked. And now, as you drift toward sleep, you feel that quiet truth settle in. Beneath every rule lies a ripple of resistance. Beneath every robe, a story waiting to be revealed. And sometimes the most powerful history is the one written where no one thought to look. You find yourself wandering through candlelit chambers lined with heavy parchment and whispered intentions. A time when truths were often clothed in Latin and desire hid behind theology. Welcome to Renaissance Europe, a world where speaking of pleasure out loud was scandalous, but writing about it under the veil of moral instruction, entirely acceptable. You didn't talk about sex in polite society, but you could read about it so long as it came wrapped in scripture and scholastic restraint. Thus was born one of history's strangest literary creations, the Christian Marriage Manual. Written not by lovers, but by monks, celibate clerics, and theologians, These texts served as instruction guides for married couples on the divine mechanics of intimacy. But make no mistake, this wasn't poetry or passion. These manuals were not so subtly disguised blueprints of the church's vision of bedroom behavior. The goal? Procreation. Nothing more, certainly nothing joyful. You might have found titles like De Matrimonio or The Book of the Family on a well-read shelf. Harmless enough, right? But flip through the pages, and you'd uncover a labyrinth of rules, diagrams, calendars, and a dizzying list of forbidden days. No intimacy on feast days, not during Lent. Sundays? Absolutely not. Nearly half the calendar was off limits, and the looming fear of sin lingered between the sheets. How Europe didn't dwindle into extinction is, frankly, a mystery. Even the act itself came under scrutiny. Joy was discouraged. Passion looked down upon. Love? Acceptable, so long as it remained meek and never too enthusiastic. Men were warned not to let desire lead them too far from duty, and women were expected to approach intimacy with silence and submission. Intercourse was framed as a spiritual transaction. Just enough heat to spark a soul, never enough to awaken the flesh. And yet, people read these books voraciously. They weren't reading for the holiness either. For many, these manuals were a sanctioned peek into a forbidden world. A marriage guide could sit openly on your shelf. What you marked inside, however, that was between you and your curiosity. Because these books, with all their solemn words and diagrams, were often the only form of printed material that spoke of sex at all. And within those pages, between discussions of sin and virtue, there was space for imagination to roam. But where the church drew a line, Renaissance creativity found a loophole. Alongside the moral instruction came another type of book, one that claimed to be academic but carried just enough sensual tension to blur the lines between medicine and fantasy. These were the anatomical texts, written by scholars, adorned by artists, and dissected in the name of science, but viewed by many for far more personal reasons. You see, the Renaissance had sparked a fascination with the human body. Dissection was no longer taboo in some corners of Europe. Artists and physicians like Leonardo da Vinci, Andreas Vesalius, and others turned their gaze inward, literally. Books like De Humani Corporis Fabrica were groundbreaking studies of anatomy, complete with highly detailed, full-body illustrations. Educational? Absolutely. Innocent? Not entirely, because these weren't cold, detached diagrams. These were artistic, idealized renderings of the naked human form, especially the female form. Women depicted not as patients, but as muses. Their bodies laid bare in clinical elegance. Breasts, hips, soft contours, all drawn with a strange blend of reverence and allure. One famous image showed a nude woman reclining like a goddess from a painting, except her chest cavity was delicately peeled open, her internal organs displayed like fine lace. It was a bizarre fusion of scientific exploration and quiet seduction. You were expected to study the digestive tract. Many, however, found themselves lingering elsewhere. Since explicit imagery was banned under religious law, these illustrations skated under the radar. A young man caught gazing too long at a sensual woodcut could claim he was studying the skeletal system. That the page was dog-eared and smudged? Surely just academic enthusiasm. And some publishers knew exactly what they were doing. Certain editions were printed with extra attention to curves, light, and posture, turning educational anatomy into something closer to soft-lit art. These weren't seedy publications tucked away in alleyways. They were issued by respected university presses. Doctors owned them, libraries shelved them. The lines between art, science, and something else entirely grew thinner with every flip of the page. And so, in a world obsessed with sin and salvation, the body remained the great unspoken desire, examined through charts, explained through scripture, and glimpsed just barely in the spaces between ink and implication. Now, as you drift gently into sleep, think of those quiet readers long ago, candle in hand, turning pages slowly, curiously, carefully, not seeking scandal, but some small truth about the human heart and body, hidden in plain sight, cloaked in respectability, waiting to be discovered. Because sometimes the most telling histories are the ones written in margins. You open a creaking cabinet in the back corner of a Renaissance library, and beneath dust-covered scrolls and cracked leather covers, you find them. Books that weren't meant to be seen in daylight. They didn't pretend to be about anatomy. They weren't cloaked in church language. These were something else entirely. Books of glances, whispers, tension. Manuals for the soul who wanted to flirt with fire and not get burned. You weren't supposed to desire such things. But if you were a nobleman with charm or a lady with curiosity, you might have found yourself holding one of these velvet-draped secrets. Half etiquette guide, half romantic playbook, these love manuals were designed for the art of suggestion. They didn't dare mention desire directly. Instead, they taught it in riddles, gestures, and prose that shimmered with implication. Unlike the bone-dry marriage guides handed down from pulpits, these manuals moved with a subtle grace. They offered instructions on sighing with meaning, tilting the head just so during a slow court dance, or writing letters laced with longing while still maintaining the illusion of virtue. They walked the razor's edge between chaste and scandalous, pages heavy with coded affection that could melt even the sternest chaperone's gaze. You'd find chapters with titles like On Catching the Eye of a Countess in the Garden, or How to Compliment a Lady's Lute Playing Without Earning a Slap. There were sample dialogues, lines so rehearsed they belonged more to the stage than to life, but they worked. And nestled among these were pages of fictional letters between make-believe nobles like Count Lorenzo and Lady Fiorella. They began with virtue and ended in implication, and if your imagination filled in the blanks, well, the book had done its job. The Renaissance mind adored double meanings, and these manuals delivered them like poetry. Riddles and miniature verses dotted the margins. The phrasing was clever, the rhyme playful, but beneath the literary charm lived the quiet pulse of rebellion. One book advised men to trim their fingernails and keep their teeth clean so that when kissed, a lady would feel neither scratched nor insulted. Another warned women to avoid onions before a romantic exchange, not for religious purity, but for breath that wouldn't end the moment before it began. These books didn't describe intimacy directly. They didn't have to. They created a space for it to almost exist. And in that suspended tension, they became electric. For many, they were a legal escape hatch in a world where even thoughts could be sinful. But not every book played coy. Some texts didn't whisper, they sang. Among the most coveted of these was a Roman relic resurrected in Renaissance hands, The Art of Love. Ostensibly a classical masterpiece, this work offered a step-by-step guide to romantic pursuit, from charming glances in the theater to the delicate dance of jealousy and seduction. It was witty, sharp, and utterly at odds with the moral climate of the time, which, of course, made it wildly popular. You wouldn't find it openly displayed in a scholar's library. But look behind a Bible or beneath the velvet lining of a noblewoman's trunk, and there it was, sometimes rebound in plain leather, sometimes filled with margin notes like, "Try this during carnival," or "This line worked on Cecilia." Education, it seemed, had many uses. And then there was the Golden Ass, a mythical narrative on the surface, but underneath, a sultry tale brimming with magic, transformation, and decidedly unholy experiences. It was technically a spiritual journey, but let's be honest. It was also a tale of bodies in motion, curiosity unbound, and the occasional talking donkey just to keep things surreal. Renaissance Italy also found its way to the East, embracing Arabic and Greek love poetry imported in hushed secrecy. These texts often reframed pleasure as a pathway to spiritual enlightenment, a fusion of passion and philosophy. You couldn't find them in market stalls, but if you knew the right printer, the right scholar, and had enough gold, a copy might appear wrapped in silk and secrecy. Bookshops knew the rules of the game. Officially, they sold theology and grammar. Unofficially, behind the counter, a locked cabinet held what was labeled private readings. With a discreet wink and a few extra coins, your request might be fulfilled. The church called it sin. Printers called it profit. Some aristocrats even commissioned personalized manuscripts, complete with gold leaf, cherubic borders, and occasionally, rather daring artwork that no cherub should have witnessed. These weren't just books. They were experiences, whispered about behind fans at masquerades, quoted in poems beneath the moonlight, and passed hand to hand like treasures of the forbidden mind. Everyone pretended they read them for the Latin. But you know better, because in a world ruled by doctrine and duty, these books were sparks. They didn't burn the system down, but they warmed the hearts of those left cold by its rules. They offered a glimpse of something richer, riskier, and far more human. And as the Inquisition's eyes grew sharper and the Church's grip tighter, these books survived, not because they were safe, but because they whispered truths no law could silence. Now, as you drift into sleep, imagine the flicker of candlelight over parchment, the soft rustle of pages turned in secret, and the thrill of a line that wasn't just read, but felt. In the quiet space between the sacred and the scandalous, the human heart always finds a way to speak. You lean closer to the flickering candlelight, the room quiet, the world outside hushed, and you turn the page. But this isn't just any page. It's part of something hidden, dangerous, and impossibly tempting. Because in 1559, the Church did something it could never quite undo. It made a list of what not to read. You're now entering the world of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the infamous catalog of forbidden books created by Pope Paul IV. A literary blacklist filled with works considered too rebellious, too curious, or far too intoxicating for the soul. Not just theology that veered from doctrine, but books on stars, love, anatomy, and even poetry that dared to make people think. You might have expected to find heretics and astrologers on that list, but also there were authors who simply wrote about longing or dared to interpret scripture with a hint of independence. Suddenly, owning a book wasn't just about reading, it was a statement. It could bring penance, house raids, or even prison time. Scholars were summoned to explain why a volume of The Art of Love was hidden among their Aristotle. But here's the twist. The very act of banning made these books irresistible. Across Europe, an underground dance began. In Venice, Lyon, and Basel, printers started producing two versions of the same text, one clean for the public, and one full, uncut version for private hands. Sometimes the difference was subtle. A softened passage, a bland illustration, or a completely fabricated title page. One cheeky edition of the Golden Ass was rebound under the name Sermons of St. Augustine. Families with private libraries turned into quiet revolutionaries. Secret compartments, hollowed-out bindings, mirrored doors, bookshelves became treasure chests of the unspoken. And those who knew how to read between the lines, they flourished. Women, in particular, found clever ways to participate. They were rarely seen as intellectual threats, so they carried, copied, and shared texts disguised as devotion. In Naples, a nun was said to keep a copy of a steamy Arabic manuscript behind her Lives of the Saints. No one suspected her, not at first. Inside the walls of convents, things weren't always as holy as they appeared. These institutions, while cloaked in piety, also held something else: literacy. And with literacy came longing. Many young women were placed in religious life by families who couldn't afford a dowry or feared their independence. So, within those cloisters grew a quiet storm. Women educated, isolated, and burning with questions. Step into a convent library. You'd find volumes of saints and sermons, yes, but beneath them, scribbled margins with suspiciously passionate notes. Poems written in coded rhyme. Even hand-copied love letters smuggled between psalms. One nun in Ferrara translated The Art of Love into the local tongue for study. Of course, others wrote their own verses, haunting, melancholic, rich with hunger for something just beyond reach. Anatomical texts were present too, justified as medical necessity, since nuns often cared for the sick. But let's not pretend that every illustration was observed clinically. One abbess in Florence petitioned to keep her convent's anatomical book because it helped the young sisters understand temptation. A creative argument and likely not the full story.